James Brewer. Jim began his storytelling career at the Pasquaney Inn on Newfound Lake in 1985. At that time, he was still a distinguished English teacher at Holderness School, where he is invited back annually to tell stories for their 50th reunion class. After he retired from teaching, Jim became increasingly well known as a storyteller, performing at area schools and campgrounds, heading up the U.S. Forest Service's Woods in Winter storytelling program, as well as a group for Dartmouth Institute for Lifelong Education. Jim has also been doing some poetry reading for our Opeechee Harbor residents. And tonight Jim brings us a presentation which he's entitled, Streaking Remembered, Summer Camp 1946, Untold World War II Story, and Bits and Pieces. Here for his fifth presentation at Taylor Community, please join me in welcoming Jim Brewer.
And it's a treat to have this audience. When I retired from the Corner House a good many years ago, I really thought I was leaving storytelling because the audience there is very well trained in terms of storytelling. You heard it's on the docket. They've been doing it for many years, and it's a real pleasure to tell stories there. But then my first year here, I found myself involved in doing a Christmas bit that I'd done at the Corner House, and I discovered that this audience was every bit as good as the Corner House audience, and that's really all a storyteller asks for is a responsive audience. I've even got a theory about that a good many of you, I could ask for a show of hands, but I won't, but when you were small children, you listened to the radio. Yes. What an adventure in imagination listening to the radio is. You have to create your own characters and setting, and didn't think anything about it at the time, but I can remember when I assembled the proper number of box tops and sent in a dime, and I got a picture of the Lone Ranger. They didn't have it right. He didn't look like that. I knew what he looked like. But that's the beauty of radio, and I think it's turned out wonderful audiences here. I want to start with a few of the bits and pieces. One is a bumper sticker that I saw not too long ago, which read, "I started out with nothing, and I've still got a lot of it left." You could get pretty philosophical about that one. But, and two lists. You know, people are always sending me lists of this and that, and there are a couple of items I liked. One was really strange things left behind at the Dublin airport, and what they felt was the top of their list was a rather well-decorated gravestone, rather oddly inscribed. It said, "I shall never forget you." And one more, Peter may be familiar with this one. There was a list of questions that lawyers have asked witnesses, and the witnesses' responses. And out of that list, one jumped out at me. It was the lawyer who asked a doctor, "Doctor, is it true that when people die during the night, they do not know what's happened until the morning?" Which is certainly a wonderfully posed question. To which the good doctor answered, "Did you pass the bar exam?" Well, streaking, let's see now. Streaking, I'm sure you remember the basic equipment. Involved a bag, 2 eye holes, and the best running shoes you could find. And it was sort of a thing of the 70s, but at Holderness School, after I'd retired, you need a little geography. Behind the dining hall at Holderness School, there is a semicircular road. On the outside of the road are 6 faculty houses. each faculty house has a wing attached that has 8 to 12 girls in it. And that's basically, at that time, was the girls' campus. And I lived in the second house down, but I was gone when this happened, and a good friend of mine, Jim Hammond, lived in the third house down, and the dean of women lived in the sixth house, which was over here on the other side. And what had happened fairly late in the spring was that a group of boys had streaked the girls' campus, which produced a talk from the headmaster saying that all the obsolete, stupid, out-of-time things that you could possibly think of to do, this was it. And his message was clear that he really, really didn't want to see this happening again. And I was a headmaster for a while, and what I learned was when I felt I'd really covered the ground and made a definitive statement, there were a couple of hundred minds out there that were looking for loopholes. Who would have thought that retribution was in the air? 2 weeks before the end of school, just before study hour, my friend Jim Hammond was walking home. He was just at the very beginning of the circle, and he was preoccupied with something, possibly just the contemplation of the end of school. And he heard the sound of running feet, which is not entirely unusual, and he looked up, and coming around the bend were a group of young women who were streaking. And this was something he had not seen in his 42 years of teaching. And at that moment, the dean of women who lived over in that sixth house had seen the girls start from wherever they started from, and she opened her front door and she saw Jimmy, and she yelled to Jimmy, "Jimmy, Jimmy, do something!" To which Jimmy replied, "What?" Well, we don't know what fear and awe the girls struck into the boys' campus as they raced around, or whether anybody even saw them. But my favorite story has to go back another 15 years or so. And when I was at Phillips, Exeter, a little bit of geography, my dormitory, the apartment I lived in, sort of projected out of the side of a hill, and there were 16 steps down from my apartment to the ground level. And rarely left the dorm that way. And what I could do was walk down through the dorm. Halfway down on the left-hand side, there was an 8-step stairway. That was a lot easier way to get to the outside. And the sophomore English teachers used to meet once a month at my house, and it was just a casual meeting, talking about what was new, talking shop, the kind of thing that was fun with that group. There were 3 women and 4 men aside from myself, and we all taught other sections at other levels, but at any rate, this was the sophomore teachers, and we had teachers of sophomores, and we had a good time. But it was getting around to study hour, so we broke up and we walked down the corridor, and some of the people had gone down the stairs, and there was a little vestibule before that outside door, and they hadn't left yet, and then there were 2 or 3 or 4 more people on the stairs, and then I was standing at the head of the stairs with 1 more person. And we got talking about something. This does happen to English teachers. And suddenly the door blew open, and a streaker jumped into the security of the dormitory and closed the door. Was very worried about pursuit, though I've never seen anybody pursue a streaker. But anyway, he was deeply concerned about it. So before the bemused members of the English department, he crouched a little and was looking out the door very carefully. Finally, he decides that nobody is chasing him, so he closes the door. He's home safe. He's made it. He reaches up, and with a sigh, he takes off his paper bag, and he turns around to find himself being watched closely by 8 bemused members. I have always hoped that his life held no more embarrassing experiences than that moment. The teachers were merciless. The one I liked best was one of the women had a wonderful deep voice, and she said, "Looking good tonight, Tom." Well, he sort of had his first realization that these people were here, and then came the second realization that his only way, except bursting out of the dorm and running around naked again, was to go up the steps. And so he was clutching his paper bag, and he made his way up the steps, enduring all kinds of comments. He finally had made it, and among the others, everybody knew this guy. Among the people there were his junior, somebody who taught him as a junior, and as he was turning to race up the next set of stairs to absolute safety, why his teacher said, "See you in class tomorrow, Tom?" A neophyte in the group asked if we should report this to the dean's office, and there was a universal agreement that no, that the dean's office in its little collection of punishments had nothing that even came close to his experience in meeting us all. I believe it was in 1943. I had 2 sisters. I have 2 sisters who were 5 and 6 years older than I. And what had happened was that a number of their boyfriends, whom I had known and liked, and had gone off to war, and some of them hadn't come home, and some of them had come home in pretty bad shape. And my parents, I think, felt, well, it'll be good for Jimmy to be off at a boys' camp for the summer. And so I was shipped off without much discussion to Grand Isle Camp for Boys on Grand Isle, on Lake Champlain. Now, there are some things that we did in advance. There was a little questionnaire that asked what I wanted as my Indian name. This was sort of an Indian-themed camp. And I really had not had any experience choosing Indian names. And so at age 12 or 13 or whatever I was, I came up with Red Feather, which I thought was sort of nice. The camp uniform had to be picked up at Abercrombie and Fitch. They did not deliver. And there was a passage in there about the fact that some of the nights on Lake Champlain could get a little chilly, so you wanted to make sure you had an adequate blanket as part of your kit. My father went to Abercrombie and Fitch to pick up the camp uniforms, which I was sort of excited about. I thought camp uniform was going to be something. And while he was there, he thought, I'll get my boys some blankets. And he brought home a pair of 3-stripe Hudson Bay blankets, which would have been perfectly adequate if I was going into the far north. They filled the bottom half of my little trunk that I was taking to camp. I don't remember how I got there, whether they had a bus. Most of the kids there were from my area. It seemed like a big enough camp at the time, but looking back on it, it actually, I found a picture and I said, who's this little group? And that was the camp. And there were 24 boys and 4 or 5 counselors, and of course during that era, while digging up counselors was sort of difficult. These were retreads, let's say. The people you'd normally expect to be counselors were busy someplace else. And so there were 4 cabins with 6 boys in each, and there was a dining hall and small activities room, and there was the big chiefs. We called him Big Chief. All the counselors were chief. Oh, and I should mention one more thing. It said I should bring old sneakers. I didn't have old sneakers, I just had my pair of sneakers. This was a problem. So my mother and I went out and bought new sneakers so that I could have a pair of old sneakers. But that was the period when rubber was no longer available, and my new sneakers had incredibly heavy black soles. Remember those things which streaked every time you went on a floor that had any kind of finish on it? I didn't like them. So my new sneakers became my old sneakers for whatever purpose it was going to be. Now, one of the prime activities at camp is swimming, and the waterfront there was sort of disappointing because it had a little string of buoys and not much else. And I think for the age group, maybe 13 to 15, 12 to 15-year-olds, they didn't want anybody going out on Lake Champlain in any kind of a boat, so they didn't have any boats. And swimming, a lot of the joy was taken out of swimming because there wasn't any beach, it was all shale. And to enter the water, why, you need to wear your old sneakers. And that took a lot of the spontaneity out of play around the waterfront when you had to, I had on my new old sneakers. And so you'd plod into the water till you were at a depth where you could swim, and then you would submerge yourself and take your sneakers off and leave them on the bottom and sort of look around for landmarks that might help you discover them. And then here was this daunting mass of water going all the way over to New York State, and because of the shale, why it was tinted green and it seemed sort of unhealthy anyway, and frolicking on the waterfront was just not something we did. However, every time I smell ivory soap, I'm reminded of the other activity that we did on the waterfront, which today's children do not know anything about, and that was the soap dip. I put on my new old sneakers early in the morning. There was usually an onshore breeze, which was unpleasant. Take the towel, which at camp was never quite dry, and go down and go out and submerge and clunk back in and soap up and clunk back in and rinse and clunk back out and use the damp towel and then clunk back to your cabin to change your clothes. And anytime I smell ivory soap, why I'm reminded of that particular routine. How many of you have been to soap dip? Yes, all right, there's some soap dip people here. Well, things started out, aside from the swimming being a dud, my bunkmates in my particular cabin were Roaring Bear and Howling Wolf. And as Red Feather, I felt kind of droopy. My blankets made a beautiful bunk. Scarlet blanket, black striped, and it was just terrific until I got into it, and after about 15 minutes, why, I would be absolutely soaking, and I would have to push the blanket back, and then the sheet wasn't adequate, so I would spend the whole night going back and forth. I mentioned the problem to my counselor, and he said he would see if he could do anything about it, and he didn't do anything about it. So Red Feather was having a somewhat difficult time. At that point, I was large for my size. I was very uncoordinated, and I compensated for that by being extremely slow afoot. And the camp activities seemed to consist of an awful lot of galloping about and doing things and capture the flag and softball. softball, perhaps some of you have been in the position where you choose up sides and you're the last person chosen and you're sent to right field with a sincere hope that nobody hits the ball out there. And there were, at least twice a week, there were bonfires, and at the bonfires, why, feathers were handed out. And when you arrived at the camp where you're given a little leather skull cap with slots in it, and you got one feather for showing up. And then feathers were awarded generously for all kinds of things at these twice a week campfires. And as time passed, why, I didn't acquire any new feathers. And some of the people who were returnees to the camp, there was a strap you could get back for the back of your leather skull cap that had more slots in it, and you could put feathers in that if you had earned enough, and you looked sort of like a Sioux war chief. So things weren't too good for Red Feather. Finally, maybe about the end of the second week, beginning of the third week, I was looking at the sign-up list, and way at the bottom it said riflery, and somehow that hadn't penetrated. And I asked what that was, and they explained that way off on the corner of the property behind some trees there was a little 2-target range. And so I signed up for that. And I reported for my first session of riflery. And they explained the various positions, and they explained the prone and the kneeling and the offhand. And I wasn't rude enough or bright enough or whatever to say, you can't be serious. Because my father believed there were two skills a young outdoorsman ought to have. One, he ought to be able to cast a fly. And so I had started off very early with a switch and a bit of fly line, and I had had a book under my elbow, and I had gotten the rhythm, and I could cast. Eventually I got a small fly rod, and I could cast very well. However, at camp, there was no place for casting very well. The other thing he believed in was that one should be a good wing shot. And he used to go off pheasant hunting and quail hunting, and obviously that was not something I could do as a small person, but he also shot a lot of skeet. And so at an early age, I went along, and at first I didn't have anything in my hand, and I would just mimic his motion as he, is this about to disappear in some way? No. I would mimic his motions as he swung through and followed a bird. And then, I don't know at what age, I was given a little double-barrel pop gun that shot 2 corks, which were irrelevant and were immediately cut off. But I would stand beside Father, and I would track the bird and go click, click at it. And then I was given the world's smallest .22 rifle. It was a bolt-action, single shot, 22 short rifle, and I was given the rifle, and the ammunition, of course, was hidden away. And Father took me along and had me following the clay birds, and then finally I was given some ammunition, and I had progressed to the point where occasionally, sort of like Annie Oakley, I was hitting a clay bird with a rifle. So when they said, okay, here's the prone position that you're going to shoot your first targets in, where you lie down and you prop your gun up on your elbows and you shoot at a fixed target that's down there, that's when I almost would have said, you gotta be kidding. It was duck soup. And my first, you only got to shoot a couple of targets because it was such a popular activity, and I expect ammunition was dear at that time. But my first 2 targets were great successes. I'd earned 2 feathers. So that shaped up quickly, and that was good for my prestige in the boys' camp that age, because I was rather quickly recognized as one of the best shots in the group. And that was deemed pretty important stuff, even if I had to go to right field when we played softball. my breakthrough moment came at dinner one night. It was a Wednesday, and this was the night that Big Chief told stories in his house, which was, as I look back on it, was a small cabin, place that you entered, and there was a fireplace straight ahead, and there was a living room that went all the way across the front, and then there were doors to the left and right of the fireplace, and their bedrooms and bathroom were back there. And so for storytelling, why all the campers sat on the floor and the counselors sat around the edge, and Big Chief stood in front of the fireplace and told his stories. So it was a Wednesday night, and one of the ways that they were coping with food for that age group during the war was that they would have an enormous cauldron of soup and lots of puffy, sort of Wonder Bread type stuff on the table. And you were invited to kill your appetite with soup and Wonder Bread, which will do it, believe me. But in this particular night, they had onion soup, which I had never experienced before, and I thought the onion soup was absolutely delicious. And nobody else at the table was terribly excited about it, so I had 3 bowls of onion soup. And then I rushed over to the storytelling because I like to sit at Big Chief's feet on the hearth of the fireplace, and all the boys crowded in, and the counselors came, and the story that night was about a white buffalo. And as the story progressed, why, I felt a certain unrest. And I realized that I perhaps was not going to make it to the end of the story, but I really wanted to, and I waited too long. The story, I remember it vividly. The great white buffalo galloped into the valley, at which point I rose and staggered for the door, and they would have parted like the Red Sea before me, but there wasn't any space. So I shared my onion soup with about half the camp. That may not be an after-dinner story. The Big Chief's wife intercepted me. She moved very quickly and said, "I think you ought to spend the night in our infirmary," which was the other bedroom in the cabin. And I think she was eager to remove me from circulation before the rest, the campers who I had anointed got out. And so she did a nice job. She found a fresh uniform for me and tucked me in, and I told her, I said, "I got these awfully heavy blankets. Would you have an extra cotton blanket I could use?" And she said, I'll see about that. And so I emerged the next day, and as soon as I went into the dining hall, why, I heard, "And the great white buffalo came." Well, fortunately, they didn't remember that one too long. That was a lot to say for that age group, and it got narrowed down, and for a while it was just the great white buffalo, and then it was great white buffalo, and then it was white buffalo, and then they'd forgotten what it was all about anyway, and they just called me white buffalo, and Red Feather was gone. So camp progressed, and at the end of camp, why, I had a respectable tier of feathers, which they wouldn't let me take home with me, which was rather disappointing. But they figured if you came back the next year, why, they would just let you start from whatever point you'd arrived at, and if you took the headdress home with you, there was no chance in that age group that it was going to return the next year, which they were right. But I did. I had earned various medals that came from the NRA, and so I was very, very proud of my medals. I had also learned a couple of songs which were not part of the camp curriculum that I learned on the side, and my first night at home I proudly sang 1.5 of them, and was told never sing those in the house again. But the really big moment came when school started and we had show and tell. And I told about the Indian-themed camp and the fact that I had a headdress, but they had kept it, but I had earned many feathers because of my excellent shooting. And I showed them my medals. And then I said, and I earned the name White Buffalo. And I didn't tell them how I earned it. A little older than the group of boys that my sisters dated, and they wished that they could date him, was a fellow named Dick Cooley. His parents were friends with my parents. Dick was a startlingly good-looking man. He had curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes and a wonderful smile. And he was an exceedingly pleasant and enjoyable person. And he was, I think he was just finishing up Yale. He was old enough, so he finished Yale before he went into service. And he rather unusually was a starting end on the football team back when they played both ways. And at the same time, he was captain of the tennis team, and which suggested that he was a very capable and diverse athlete. Dick, when his time came, went in the Air Force. He became a fighter pilot, and I don't know how many missions he flew, but at the time of we were starting the daylight bombing of Germany, and we're looking for long-range fighters that could accompany the bombers in, while the P-51 Mustang was a familiar plane. But another one that was around and was an odd-looking duck called the P-38 Lightning. And that was one that had twin engines, and the engines went back and connected with a tail that went across. And so when it flew over, you sort of saw a square, and there was a capsule in the middle in between the engines where the pilot sat above his machine guns and a 20mm cannon. And early on, it wasn't a plane that would have been a long-distance fighter, but they added fuel tanks which could be jettisoned after they were used, and suddenly increased the range of the plane so it could go in with the B-17s and during the daylight bombing. Dick was on a mission, and I believe he was over occupied France. I don't believe he'd gotten all the way to Germany yet. And his formation was attacked by Messerschmitts, and there was a melee, and part of the wing of his P-38 got blown away. And he, of course, fell out of formation and was doing everything he could to engineer a crash landing, because the P-38s had one horrible problem with that cross tail back there. They were hell to bail out of. The drill was that you turned your plane over, you let go of the canopy, you undid your shoulder straps, and then you undid your seatbelt, thank you. Undid your seatbelt and dropped out, hoping that you would drop completely out of the way of that tail before it got there. And that's why Dick wanted to make a crash landing. But the plane was so out of control, he couldn't do that. But he lost a lot of altitude, and he was above the occupied countryside there. He did manage to turn his plane almost over. He did jettison the canopy, and he got out of his harness and let go of the seat belt, and he dropped out, and that tailpiece neatly sliced off his legs just below the knee. It also knocked him out, as you might imagine, the shock of that blow. And somehow, instinct or whatever, he opened his parachute. And so there he was floating down, bleeding to death. And the scenario was not any scenario that the P-38 pilots could dream up in those circumstances. It was not very cheerful. It's something they had to think about. Dick descended into a German field hospital, literally fell into it, where he was greeted with people rushing to him with tourniquets and IVs and plasma and blood transfusions and the necessary operation to give him the base for prosthetic limbs later. And the care was incredible. Maybe it didn't hurt a bit that when they cut away his uniform, they found a magnificent young man who could have been on a recruiting poster for the German army. And it probably didn't help or hurt at all either that when he came to, that he was the world's most pleasant person. So they saved him. And then something funny happened, that the people in that field hospital normally would have sent him back to a larger hospital for prisoners of war where who knows what might have happened. But somehow, because Dick was the way he was, and maybe because he looked the way he did, and because they had saved him the way they had and given him the care they had, they didn't want that to happen. And so somehow he was passed French underground, who knows. But the Cooley family had barely started to process the fact that their son had gone down over enemy territory, and they got word that he was in a military hospital in England, and that he soon would be returning. And when he returned, he went to Walter Reed Hospital, and the surgeons at Walter Reed told the Cooleys that on a good day, in their operating theaters, with everything that they needed right there, they might have been able to do as good a job as the German surgeons had done. Well, he stayed at Walter Reed not for any further surgeries, but simply for the physical therapy and the convalescing that went on as he hardened his stumps and learned to use his prosthetics. And given his athletic ability, why, that didn't take him very long. And I saw him after he came back, and the smile was the same, and he was getting the hang of those legs, and he was starting to play tennis again. At that point, he moved to St. Louis, and I lost track of him. But I've always considered that an incredibly special moment where in the heat of warfare and the anger and the viciousness, why a group of the enemy called upon their humanity and their professionalism to give this young man the best of care and save his life and send him back to his home. Now, the last time I was telling stories here, I ended with some dealings I had with an exceptionally able student. And someone remarked to me afterwards, well, you never had to deal with anything except exceptionally able students. I said, that's not quite right. And I recall an incident. I'd been teaching maybe 6 years, and I was teaching 2 sophomore sections of English, and I was also teaching public speaking, half-credit course in public speaking that all the sophomores had to take at some point. And public speaking and Robert's Rules of Order, you can imagine. And so I had some students who were in both classes, and we had been meeting for, 6, 7 weeks. It was just about this time of year. And I had public speaking first period, and a student came up to me, who was also in my fourth period English, and he said, Sir, I spent so much time working on my English assignment that I just haven't prepared today for public speaking. I said, okay, Austin, let's maybe talk about your time and how you're spending it and see if we can get you better organized so that you can handle both. And he grunted and went away. And then at fourth period English, he came in and he said, Sir, yeah, he did, unbelievably. He said, Sir, I spend so much time working on my public speaking that I'm not prepared for English today. And I said, Austin, I teach both classes. And Austin looked at me in wonder. He hadn't noticed. So I dealt with a lot of extraordinary students. But not all of them were extraordinary intellectually. Well, you've been, as I expected, a wonderful audience, and it's been a great pleasure to be here with you tonight and share some laughs primarily. And I very much appreciate your being here. Thank you and good night.